Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on Jewish life in Russia during the 19th and 20th centuries.
Yeah.
It seems like from the sources you sent, identity is a big theme here.
Yeah, definitely. The story of Russian Jewry in this period is really all about how they forged an identity in the midst of shifting government policies, internal community debates, and a rapidly changing social landscape.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
It is.
So where do we even begin?
Well, I think a good place to start is with Tsar Alexander I's reign in the early 1800s.
Okay.
Initially, he actually considered deporting all Jews from Russia.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
Why? What was going on there?
Well, there were a few factors at play. Some historians believe Alexander was influenced by anti-Semitic advisors who saw Jews as outsiders and a threat to Russian unity. Others argue that he was motivated by a desire to modernize Russia and saw the Jewish population with its strong religious and cultural traditions as an obstacle to progress.
So right away, we see this tension between the government wanting to control and assimilate the Jewish population and the Jewish community trying to maintain their identity.
Yeah, exactly. And this tension plays out in really interesting ways throughout the rest of the century. Now, Alexander's deportation plan never actually happened.
Oh, okay.
The Napoleonic Wars kind of got in the way, and ironically, Napoleon's relatively tolerant stance on Jewish rights made Alexander reconsider his approach.
So external forces already playing a role in shaping the destinies of Russian Jews.
Yeah, for sure.
So what happened once Napoleon was out of the picture?
Well, Alexander didn't abandon his assimilationist agenda altogether.
Okay.
He set up a committee to figure out ways to integrate Jews into Russian society. And one of the key ideas that emerged was encouraging Jews to take up agriculture.
Interesting. That's a pretty big shift from their traditional occupations. Like, I know they were known for trade and finance.
You're right, and this proposal really sparked some intense debates within Jewish communities. Some saw it as a real opportunity for economic advancement and a way to prove their loyalty to the Tsar. Others were suspicious and saw it as an attempt to undermine their traditional way of life.
So did this push towards agriculture have any lasting impact?
It did have some impact, but not as transformative as the government had hoped. Many Jews struggled to adapt to farming.
Okay.
And there was also resistance from within Jewish communities and from the Russian peasantry who saw them as competitors for land.
Yeah, that makes sense. So even when the government tries to create opportunities for integration, it seems like there were often these unintended consequences and resistance from different groups.
Absolutely.
What about Alexander's successors? Did they continue this push and pull with the Jewish population?
Yeah, they did. In fact, under Tsar Nicholas I, things got even more complicated.
Okay.
He came to power in 1825.
Yeah.
And his predecessor was determined to assimilate Jews into Russian society. But his methods were, shall we say, a bit contradictory.
Contradictory? How?
Well, on one hand, Nicholas introduced military conscription for Jews. This was a major step, as it meant Jewish men were now obligated to serve alongside their Russian counterparts
Right.
in the army. It was seen as a way to foster a shared national identity.
Yeah, serving together like that could break down barriers.
Right. But at the same time that he was pushing for integration through military service, Nicholas also reinforced the Pale of Settlement,
Oh, wow.
which severely restricted the areas where Jews could live.
So serve the state, but stay segregated. It seems like those actions would send pretty mixed signals.
Exactly. And to make things even more confusing, Nicholas also continued to encourage Jewish agricultural settlements, despite the mixed success and resistance this policy had faced under Alexander I.
So we see this continuation of the government trying to mold the Jewish population into something that fits their vision of Russia, while the Jewish community is figuring out how to adapt and maintain their own identity within these constraints.
You got it. And it's in this context of contradictory policies and persistent pressures that we see a new development emerge. Calls for greater assimilation from within the Russian government itself.
Oh, really? So not just top-down pressure then?
Yeah, exactly.
What did this assimilation look like?
Well, some officials went beyond encouraging agriculture and started suggesting things like abolishing traditional Jewish communal institutions or promoting secular education over religious studies. They believed that these distinct aspects of Jewish life had to be dismantled to fully integrate them into Russian society.
You'd think Jewish communities would welcome those opportunities for greater rights and acceptance?
It's not that simple, though.
Yeah.
Many Jewish leaders resisted these calls for assimilation, fearing they'd lead to religious and cultural erosion.
Right, so it's like a threat to their way of life.
Exactly, a way of life that helped them survive centuries of persecution and maintain their unique identity.
So even when offered a path to greater inclusion, there were worries about what it would cost their faith and traditions.
Precisely. It highlights the incredibly complex dilemma faced by minority groups all throughout history. How to balance the desire for equality with the need to preserve their cultural and religious heritage. It wasn't an easy choice, and it led to a lot of internal debate within the Jewish community.
Yeah, it sounds like this internal struggle over identity, along with the external pressure from the government, created a pretty volatile situation. So where do we go from here?
Well, this tension doesn't just simmer under the surface. It eventually boils over in the late 19th century with the rise of a new and unexpected force, Jewish revolutionaries.
Hold on, Jewish revolutionaries. Now that's a twist. Tell me more. Jewish revolutionaries. Okay, that's not what I was expecting. What led them to this path?
Well, it's a fascinating part of the story. You see, in the late 19th century, Russia was kind of a hotbed for revolutionary activity. And a lot of young Jews, especially those who'd embraced secular ideas, were drawn to these movements.
Were they driven by the same things as other revolutionaries?
Yes and no. Some were definitely fueled by those same ideals of social justice, economic equality, political freedom that were driving revolutionary movements across Europe. They saw the Tsarist regime as oppressive and wanted to create a more just society for all Russians, regardless of faith.
That makes sense. But you said yes and no, so what set the Jewish revolutionaries apart?
Well, for some Jewish revolutionaries, there was this extra layer of motivation, a sense of what they called paying a historical debt to the Russian people.
Paying a historical debt. That's interesting. What do they mean by that?
Some believe that because of their historical role in things like trade and finance, they'd inadvertently contributed to the economic disparities in Russia, and they felt a sense of responsibility to try and fix that and create a more equitable society.
So it was idealism, a desire to fix these social wrongs, and this idea of historical responsibility all mixed together.
Exactly. And here's something that might surprise you. Many of these Jewish revolutionaries weren't like the stereotypical image of the poor, downtrodden rebel. They often came from relatively wealthy families. They had access to education. They were pretty well integrated into Russian society.
That is surprising. It challenges our assumptions about, who becomes a revolutionary. Do we have any examples of some of these individuals?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One prominent figure is Mark Natanson. He came from a well-off Jewish family, received a good education, but he was deeply troubled by the injustices he saw around him and became a key figure in the populist movement, which was advocating for the rights of peasants and workers.
So it really was genuine belief in social justice driving them, not just personal hardship.
Precisely. And their involvement in these movements had a big impact on the Jewish community as a whole. It fueled those debates about assimilation and identity even more. Should they focus on integrating into Russian society or forge their own path?
I imagine this was a really confusing and uncertain time for a lot of Russian Jews.
Absolutely. And tragically, it was also a time of increasing violence. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a wave of anti-Jewish pogroms sweep across Russia.
Right. We've touched on pogroms before, but can you remind us what those were and the impact they had?
Pogroms were these organized, often state-sanctioned attacks on Jewish communities. They involved violence, looting, destruction of property, even murder. They were fueled by anti-Semitism and often scapegoated Jews for economic problems or social unrest.
I remember the Kishinev pogrom of 1903 stands out as a particularly horrifying example.
Yeah, that one was a turning point for many Russian Jews. It shattered any remaining sense of safety and belonging they might have felt within Russian society. Made it clear that even assimilation and integration wouldn't protect them.
I can see how an event like that would lead to a shift in thinking. What happened after that?
Well, in the aftermath of these pogroms, you see a surge in support for Zionism, the movement advocating for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine.
So the violence and the persecution actually pushed many Jews towards the idea of creating their own homeland.
Exactly. The pogroms, coupled with the continued restrictions from the Tsarist regime, made it pretty clear that true equality and security in Russia were unlikely. Zionism offered a vision of self-determination and a safe haven from this persecution.
It's a tragic irony, isn't it? The very forces that tried to suppress and marginalize Jewish identity actually ended up strengthening the movement for Jewish statehood.
It is. And this growing desire for autonomy and self-governance intertwined with the broader revolutionary fervor that was sweeping Russia in the early 20th century. Remember, this was a period of massive social and political upheaval, culminating in the 1905 revolution.
Right, a time of strikes and protests and demands for reform. Were Jewish communities involved in this?
Absolutely. They participated in demonstrations, advocated for political change, joined revolutionary groups alongside their non-Jewish counterparts.
You'd think the government would see that as a good thing, a willingness to participate in civic life.
Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. The government viewed Jewish participation with a lot of suspicion, saw it as a threat to their authority, and it further fueled that anti-Semitic sentiment.
So even when fighting for the same freedoms as other Russians, they were still seen as outsiders and a potential danger.
Yeah, and it created this really precarious situation. The government was trying to kind of appease both sides. They offered some concessions to Jewish communities, but at the same time tried to control and limit their participation in public life.
Classic carrot and stick approach.
Exactly. And as you can imagine, this didn't really work. It just fueled resentment and further radicalized some within the Jewish community.
What kind of concessions were they offering?
They relaxed some of the restrictions on Jewish rights, like easing some of the limitations on education and residency. They even considered getting rid of the Pale of Settlement altogether. But these were often half-hearted measures met with continued discrimination and violence.
Can you give an example?
Sure. They implemented policies like the numerus clausus, which limited the number of Jewish students allowed into universities. So even when they were given opportunities for advancement, they faced these quotas and restrictions.
So 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Exactly. And sadly, even these limited reforms were often rolled back during times of social unrest or political instability.
You mentioned violence earlier. Did the pogroms continue during this time?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
The years following the 1905 revolution saw a resurgence of pogroms, often instigated by reactionary forces who blamed Jews for the unrest and wanted to restore the old order. It was a vicious cycle of violence and repression.
It's heartbreaking to see this pattern repeating itself. So we're entering the 20th century now, with the Jewish community facing increasing persecution, growing support for Zionism, and deeply involved in the revolutionary movement sweeping Russia. What happens next?
Well, as you might imagine, things are about to get even more complicated with the outbreak of World War I.
Right. A global conflict like that is bound to have ripple effects everywhere. How did the war impact the situation for Russian Jews?
The war brought new challenges and hardships. Jewish communities were often caught in the crossfire between the Russian and German armies. Their loyalty was questioned, and they were accused of spying for the enemy.
That's dangerous. Just being Jewish made you a suspect.
Exactly. And this suspicion led to mass expulsions from areas near the front lines, uprooting entire communities, forcing them into internal exile.
It's hard to imagine that fear and uncertainty, being forced from your home, accused of treason, just because of your religion.
It was a truly dark chapter. And while some Jewish leaders tried to show their loyalty by supporting the war effort, it did little to quell that deep-seated suspicion and prejudice that had been there for centuries. The war really just made the existing tensions so much worse.
So they're stuck in this no-win situation, deemed suspicious by the government, targeted by pogroms, now facing mass expulsions during wartime. It doesn't seem like there were many options available to them.
You're right. It was a desperate time for a lot of Russian Jews. And then in 1917, everything changed. The Bolshevik Revolution erupted, shook the foundations of Russian society, and ushered in a whole new era, an era that would have a profound and lasting impact on the fate of Russian Jewry.
The Bolsheviks, we've talked about their complicated relationship with the Jewish community before. This seems like a pivotal moment. How did the revolution change things? So the Bolsheviks take over, and it's this whole new world for Russia. I know they promised equality for everyone, but you mentioned their relationship with the Jewish community was kind of complicated. What happened to Russian Jews under the Bolsheviks?
It's a really complex chapter in the story. On the one hand, the Bolsheviks seemed like liberators. They immediately abolished the Pale of Settlement, outlawed any discrimination based on religion, repealed all those old Tsarist laws that had oppressed Jews for centuries.
Wow. So after decades of fighting for basic rights, suddenly there's this promise of real equality.
Right. And at first, many Jews did see them as allies. They were tired of Tsarist oppression and hoped that a communist society would truly guarantee equality for everyone. But as we've seen, things rarely work out that simply.
So what happened? Did the Bolsheviks deliver on their promises?
Well, not quite. While they were ideologically opposed to anti-Semitism, and they did put in some protections for Jewish communities early on, their broader goals ended up having some unintended and sometimes pretty devastating consequences for Jewish life.
What do you mean?
Well, their whole mission was to dismantle traditional social structures, and that included religion. They saw religion as a tool of oppression and a barrier to creating a classless society. So while they weren't specifically targeting Jews, their anti-religious policies ended up affecting all faiths, including Judaism.
So even though Jews weren't being singled out anymore, the Bolsheviks' stance on religion still had a negative impact.
Yeah, exactly. They shut down religious schools, confiscated property from synagogues, actively discouraged religious practice. Rabbis and other religious leaders were persecuted, and a lot of Jewish institutions were forced to close.
It's almost like they escaped one form of oppression just to face a new one.
It's a good way to put it, and it gets worse. While the Bolsheviks officially condemned anti-Semitism, they didn't really do much to fight it at a social level. Old prejudices lingered, and a lot of Jews still faced discrimination in everyday life, even if it wasn't officially sanctioned by the state.
So they were equal on paper, but not really treated that way.
Right. And this led to some interesting developments within the Jewish community itself. Some embraced the new Soviet system, renounced their religious beliefs, and completely integrated into this communist society. Others held onto their faith and traditions practiced in secret and tried to keep their culture alive despite all the restrictions.
So the revolution kind of split the Jewish community into those who assimilated and those who resisted.
Yeah. And this internal division, along with the constant pressure from the government, made it a really difficult environment for Jewish life to thrive. It's important to remember this wasn't one single experience for everyone. Individual stories varied a lot depending on people's beliefs, where they lived, and how they chose to navigate this new reality.
So it seems like the Bolshevik Revolution, while offering hope for equality, actually brought a whole new set of problems and complexities for Russian Jews.
Yeah, that's a good summary. And these challenges continued throughout the Soviet era with varying degrees of repression and limited opportunities for religious and cultural expression.
It shows that even revolutions that are supposed to be about equality can have unintended consequences for minority groups.
For sure. And we see that same pattern throughout history. Good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes for everyone.
Well, we've covered a lot today, from the back and forth policies of the czars to the horrors of the pogroms, the rise of Zionism, the complexities of Jewish involvement in revolutionary movements, and the challenges they faced under the Soviets. It's a story with a lot of twists and turns, a lot of triumphs, and a lot of tragedies.
It is. And it's a story that still matters today. The experiences of Russian Jews during this time raise important questions about identity assimilation, the pursuit of social change, and that delicate balance between individual rights and the power of the state.
It makes you think about the choices people had to make under those circumstances. Do they conform, resist, flee? And what are the effects of those choices both for them and for their communities?
Those are exactly the kind of questions we were hoping this deep dive would make you consider. It's a complicated history without easy answers. But I think understanding the past can help us better appreciate the challenges and the triumphs of those who came before us.
Well, we hope this exploration has helped to shed some light on this fascinating and often overlooked part of history. It's a story about the resilience of the human spirit, the lasting power of faith and culture, and the constant pursuit of freedom and equality.
And even though the specific experiences of Russian Jews might seem very different or unique, the themes of identity belonging and the desire for a just society are things everyone can relate to. They're themes that still matter today and encourage us to think about how we can create a more inclusive and equitable world.
Definitely a lot to consider. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll see you next time for another exploration of history and ideas.